Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 11 on population ecology. Normally, we hit the ground running in these lectures by jumping straight into the list of learning outcomes for this chapter. But in this case, before we do that, we are going to take a moment to define the meaning of the title of this chapter. What is population ecology? Well, ecology is a subdiscipline of biology that includes the studies and interactions between organisms and their environments. And a population is a group of individuals belonging to the same species that live and interact in a given area at a given time. Therefore, population ecology is the science that studies the way a particular species interacts with the environment and changes over time. So, in this chapter, we are going to look at using the exponential and logistic equations to predict the growth rate of populations. We will compare the environmental conditions that apply to the exponential growth model versus the logistic growth model. We will define carrying capacity. We will identify density dependent and density independent factors that limit population growth. We will interpret survivorship curves and give examples of organisms that fit each type of curve. We will explain historical, current, and future human population growth trends and their consequences. We will interpret age structure diagrams and explain the demographic transition model, what happens to birth rates, death rates, and population growth rate and population size as a country moves through the different stages in this model. And lastly, we will describe how community factors contribute to population distribution and dynamics. So, in this section, we are going to focus on the first few of these outcomes, looking specifically at models of how populations grow and the variables that go into those models. The two main variables to determine when assessing a population are its size and its density. Population size is self explanatory, it's the total number of individuals. And when modeling the growth of a population with a mathematical equation, as we will see in just a few moments, the size is represented by the variable n. The second variable is population density. Population density describes the number of individuals per unit area or volume. In other words, how closely packed a population is. These two variables can impact other characteristics of a population, such as how long the population is able to persist, how long the individuals in the population can secure resources for themselves, how well they can secure mates, and many other outcomes. So these two variables are very important, but there are other characteristics of populations as well. One of these is the dispersion of the individuals within the population, which is the pattern in which the individuals are spaced out in the area they occupy. Are they uniformly distributed like these penguin nests on the beach, or are they randomly distributed like these wildflowers in the field with no particular pattern? Or are they clumped like this herd of elephants? Another characteristic of populations is their age structure, meaning the number of individuals belonging to different age groups within the population. For example, within a population of elephants, you might look at how many babies versus adolescents versus adults versus seniors. On the left here, you see what is called an age structure diagram, which we will talk about more later. And it displays the number of individuals of the youngest ages in the bars towards the bottom, running up to the number of individuals belonging to the oldest ages in the bars at the top. You can see that the diagram also represents another characteristic of the population, which is the sex ratio, the proportion of males to females in the population. The males are represented in green on the left, the females are represented in gray on the right. And one more characteristic of populations is their growth, meaning how the population size changes over time. There are two major models that are used to represent the way the populations of organisms grow over time, which we will get into in just a moment. But before we do, it's important to establish that the growth rate of a population is determined based on the number of new organisms joining the population, minus the number of organisms leaving the population. Organisms join a population due to birth and immigration. Birth is self-explanatory, but immigration is the arrival of new members from a different population. Individuals drop out of a population due to death or emigration. Once again, death is self-explanatory, but emigration is defined as the departure of members of the population to a different location, and the opposite of immigration. Now that we've established that, let's take a look at the two major models that represent population growth. The first one is called the exponential growth model. This pattern of growth applies to populations that reproduce quickly and have access to abundant resources. The mathematical equation that is used to model this pattern of growth is this: G equals R times N. We mentioned previously that N is used to represent population size. So what are G and R? Well, G is the growth rate, and R is called the per capita rate of increase. And this number represents the average contribution made by each individual towards the growth of a population. So for species that have a really large number of offspring, like rabbits for example, the value of R is quite large. For species that have a small number of offspring, like elephants, the value of R is quite low. So overall, what this equation is saying is that if you take the population size, N, and you multiply it by how much each individual contributes to the next generation, R, then you get the growth rate. And a key point in the exponential growth model is that the population increases at an accelerating rate, meaning that the number of new organisms added to the population gets bigger with each generation. This is embodied in the fact that the slope of this line in the graph is getting steeper as time passes. With each generation that passes, the population grows, meaning that a larger number of organisms are reproducing, and their contribution to the next generation is even larger than the previous one. A real life example of a group of organisms that follow an exponential growth model is bacteria. Bacteria reproduce extremely rapidly because they consist of just a single cell. So reproducing is simply a matter of making a copy of each cell. Many bacterial species can take as little as 20 minutes to reproduce under optimal conditions. If you start off with a single bacterial cell, after the first generation you have two, but then at each of those two divide. So after the next generation you have four, and then eight, and then 16. So you can see how the growth rate increases at an accelerating rate. However, most organisms do not follow an exponential growth model because the conditions that enable exponential growth are not realistic in most situations. For most species, there is a finite number of resources available that limit their population growth and cause it to be stabilized and level off. This pattern of growth is called the logistic growth model. The mathematical equation used to represent logistic growth is similar to the exponential growth equation, but a little more complex. You can see that the first part is the same, G equals R times N. But then there's another variable in here that is new and distinct, which is K. K represents something called carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum population size that can be supported by the environment. The carrying capacity of a habitat depends on many factors, including the amount of food available, the amount of space available, etc. But what this equation is essentially showing is that as the population size n gets closer to the maximum population size k, the difference between k and n, that is, k minus n, gets closer to zero. And once k and n really are equal, the whole expression becomes zero, meaning that the growth rate, g, is zero. That's what you see going on in this graph, where the population rate levels off once it reaches the carrying capacity of the environment. In the next section, we will be talking more about carrying capacity and the different factors that are involved in limiting population growth.